My parents vanished from my life 3 years ago. They left me with nothing but emptied bank accounts and a shattered reality. So when a heavy taped box appeared on my front porch yesterday afternoon with a note in my mother's handwriting that simply read, "Do not let it out," my blood ran completely cold. Then the scratching started. It was a frantic and violent clawing coming from inside the thick cardboard. I backed away and dialed 911 immediately. But when the responding officer finally sliced through the packing tape and looked inside, he did not draw his weapon. Instead, his face went entirely pale. He turned to me and asked the one question that will haunt me for the rest of my life. "Ma'am, where is your daughter?" Before I tell you exactly what was inside that box and the terrifying nightmare that unfolded next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. My name is Sarah. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior financial auditor at a large corporate firm in downtown Chicago. My entire life revolves around ledgers and compliance reports, and finding the absolute truth hidden inside complex numbers. I like predictability. I like strict rules. After my husband Mark passed away suddenly 4 years ago, predictability became my only source of comfort. It was just me and my 6-year-old daughter Lily against the world. I built a very quiet and disciplined life for us in a safe suburban neighborhood. We had our daily routines and we never deviated from them. Every single morning we woke up at 6 o'clock. We ate warm oatmeal with blueberries in our small kitchen. I carefully braided her dark hair, and I drove her to her private Christian elementary school. I worked 60-hour weeks and stretched my budget to the absolute limit to pay for that specific school because of their strict security protocols and their gated campus. I needed to know she was completely safe while I was at the office. I thought I had accounted for every single variable in our lives. I had no idea that the greatest threat to my child was the very people who brought me into this world. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the illusion of our safe life was utterly destroyed. I had come home early from a long client meeting to finish some quarterly audit reports at my dining room table. The sky overhead was overcast and the neighborhood was perfectly still. As I walked up my driveway, holding my briefcase, I noticed a large brown cardboard box sitting squarely on my front welcome mat. I had not ordered anything online. I approached it casually at first, thinking it was simply a misdelivered package for one of my neighbors. The box was roughly the size of a microwave, heavily wrapped in thick silver duct tape. There was no shipping label anywhere. There was no return address. There was only a crisp, white envelope taped securely to the top flap. I set my briefcase on the concrete and reached down to pull the envelope free. I opened the flap and pulled out a single piece of heavy cardstock. Written in elegant looping cursive were 5 words: "Do not let it out." I stopped breathing entirely. I would recognize that handwriting anywhere in the world. It was immaculate and demanding and perfectly spaced. It was the exact same handwriting that used to sign my birthday cards before my entire life fell apart. It was my mother's handwriting. My parents, Robert and Patricia, had not spoken to me in 3 long years. They ghosted me completely after committing the ultimate financial and emotional betrayal. Following my husband Mark's tragic accident, I received a $300,000 life insurance payout. I was devastated and blindly grieving, and trying to figure out how to raise a toddler completely alone. My parents swooped in, playing the role of the loving and supportive family. They convinced me to transfer the funds to an investment account they managed, promising to secure Lily's future and protect my assets. I trusted them. They were my parents. I was blinded by my own grief and vulnerability. But they did not invest that money for my daughter. They drained every single cent of it to pay for my sister Jessica's $250,000 country club wedding to a shady corporate lawyer named Trent. When I discovered the missing funds through my own auditing skills and confronted them, my mother looked me dead in the eye and told me Jessica deserved a perfect day. They abandoned me and Lily without a second thought, leaving me to rebuild my life from absolute zero, while they posted photos of their lavish lifestyle online. So standing on my porch, looking at my mother's handwriting after 3 years of dead silence, a wave of pure nausea washed over me. Why was she leaving a package at my door? Why now, after all this time? Before my analytical brain could process the warning on the card, the box moved. It literally lurched an inch to the left across the concrete mat, scraping against the ground. I jumped back, dropping the card. A frantic and desperate scratching sound echoed from inside the thick cardboard. Something was alive in there. Something was clawing at the walls of the box, trying desperately to escape. The scratching grew louder and more erratic, accompanied by a strange, rhythmic thumping sound. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I am an auditor. I deal in logic and verifiable facts. I do not deal with mysterious moving boxes left by estranged and abusive family members. I did not hesitate for a second. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed 911. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately. I struggled to keep my voice steady as I explained that a suspicious and moving package had been left on my porch by an estranged family member who had a history of severely hurting me. The dispatcher instructed me to step far away from the box and wait inside my locked car until an officer arrived. I backed down the driveway, never taking my eyes off the shifting cardboard. The scratching continued. It was a terrible, relentless sound that sent actual shivers down my spine. Waiting for the police felt like standing in an endless nightmare. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. My parents were cruel and financially abusive, but they were wealthy country club socialites. They were not physically violent. Why would they leave an animal or something dangerous on my doorstep? Was it a sick joke to intimidate me? Was it a threat to keep me quiet about the money they stole all those years ago? I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, listening to the distant wail of approaching sirens cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon. A local patrol car pulled onto my street a few minutes later, flashing its lights. Officer Davis, a tall man with a calm and commanding demeanor, stepped out and approached me. I gave him the details, speaking rapidly and pointing at the box on the porch. I explained the estrangement and the warning note. He instructed me to stay back by my vehicle while he investigated the threat. I watched from the driveway, clutching my chest as he walked up the front steps. He shone his heavy flashlight over the box, inspecting the thick silver tape. The scratching and thumping sound was clearly audible now, echoing off the brick front of my house. Officer Davis frowned, resting his hand cautiously near his utility belt. "Ma'am, I am going to open this." He called back to me over his shoulder. "Stay exactly where you are." He pulled a heavy folding knife from his pocket. The air around us felt suffocatingly heavy. I held my breath, expecting something horrifying to leap out and attack him. Officer Davis carefully sliced through the thick layers of tape along the top seam. He used the blade to pry the cardboard flaps open and stepped back quickly, giving whatever was inside room to emerge. Nothing came out. The frantic scratching sound continued echoing from the depths of the box, but nothing leaped forward. Officer Davis slowly leaned forward and peered inside the shadowy interior. I watched his entire body language change instantly. The defensive tension in his shoulders dropped, but it was very quickly replaced by a profound and chilling stillness. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not pull out his radio to call for backup. He just stood there looking down into the cardboard, his face draining of all natural color. "Officer," I asked, my voice trembling so hard I could barely form the words. "What is it? What is inside?" He did not answer me right away. He reached his large hands into the box and pulled out a small object. As he turned toward me, holding the item out in the gray afternoon light, my knees nearly buckled beneath me. It was a mechanical, battery-operated toy, a small plush robotic puppy. It was Lily's absolute favorite toy in the world, the one she slept with every single night and carried around the house. Its little plastic paws were moving frantically in the air, creating the exact scratching and rhythmic thumping sound I had heard against the cardboard walls. But that was not what made the veteran police officer go pale. that was not what made the entire world stop spinning around me. The toy puppy was tightly wrapped in a familiar navy blue knitted cardigan. It was a child's school sweater. Stitched clearly into the left breast of the fabric was the gold and white crest of St. Jude's Christian Academy. It was Lily's school uniform, and strapped tightly around the neck of the robotic puppy, acting as a makeshift collar, was a bright pink silicone watch, a GPS tracking watch. The exact tracking watch I strapped onto Lily's tiny wrist every single morning before I kissed her forehead and dropped her off at the school gates. Officer Davis walked slowly down the porch steps, carrying the wrapped toy. He looked at the school crest. He looked at the pink tracking watch. Then he looked directly into my eyes with an expression of deep professional dread. "Ma'am," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet and serious. "Where is your daughter right now?" The breath left my lungs in a violent rush. My vision blurred at the edges as a wave of pure primal terror washed over me. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely paralyzed. The logical numbers-driven world I had built to protect us shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the concrete driveway. The warning note from my mother suddenly made perfect and horrifying sense. "Do not let it out." She was not talking about a wild animal inside the box. She was telling me not to let the secret out. She was telling me she had the upper hand. "She is at school." I finally gasped, my voice sounding like it belonged to a frightened stranger. "She is supposed to be safely at school." Officer Davis immediately grabbed the radio attached to his shoulder. "Dispatch, I need a unit at St. Jude's Christian Academy immediately for a possible child abduction." The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Abduction. My parents had not just returned to taunt me or ask for more money. They had bypassed all of my careful security measures. They had bypassed the gated campus and the strict sign-out sheets. They had forcefully removed the GPS tracking watch so I could not locate her, and they had sent it to me in a box to let me know exactly who was in control. My golden child sister and my manipulative parents had taken the only thing in this world that mattered to me. And as I stood there, staring at my daughter's favorite toy, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the war for my daughter's life had just begun. The ride in the back of the police cruiser felt like moving through thick mud. The world outside the windows blurred into a chaotic streak of suburban houses and green lawns. The siren wailed above us, screaming a warning to the neighborhood, but all I could hear was the deafening sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. My hands gripped the edge of the vinyl seat so hard, my knuckles turned completely white. I am a financial auditor. My entire career is built on the foundation of control and verifiable facts and catching discrepancies before they turn into disasters. But sitting in that speeding patrol car with Lily's robotic puppy, wrapped in her school sweater, sitting on the front passenger seat next to Officer Davis, I had absolutely zero control. My 6-year-old daughter was missing. The very people who brought me into this world had bypassed every single security measure I had meticulously put in place. Officer Davis gripped the steering wheel and spoke rapidly into his radio, calling ahead to the local precinct and requesting additional units at St. Jude Christian Academy. The school was only a mile away from my house, but the distance felt like an ocean. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of his head, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. Please let her be sitting in her classroom. Please let this be a sick and twisted game to scare me. But the cold logic in my brain, the auditor part of my mind that analyzes patterns and outcomes, knew the terrifying truth. My mother did not play games. Patricia only made a move when she had already secured the victory. The patrol car lurched violently as we swerved into the school parking lot, jumping the curb slightly before slamming to a halt right in front of the main entrance. I did not wait for the officer to open my door. I shoved it open and scrambled out, hitting the pavement at a full sprint. The heavy double doors of the private academy were locked. I slammed my fists against the reinforced glass, pressing the buzzer over and over again until the receptionist finally looked up from her desk. Her eyes widened in alarm when she saw me standing there with a uniformed police officer right behind me. The magnetic lock buzzed loudly, and I shoved the doors open so hard they slammed against the brick walls. "Where is Lily?" I screamed. The quiet and peaceful atmosphere of the reception area shattered instantly. Teachers down the hall peeked out of their classrooms. The receptionist, a sweet older woman named Mrs. Gable, jumped up from her chair and held her hands up defensively. "Sarah, please calm down." Mrs. Gable stammered, her eyes darting nervously between me and the police officer. "Lily is fine. She was picked up early." The floor beneath my feet felt like it simply vanished. The air was sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping. Picked up by who? I demanded, my voice cracking violently. "I am the only person on her authorized list. I specifically told this administration that nobody else is allowed to take my child off this campus." Officer Davis stepped forward, placing a firm and calming hand on my shoulder. "Ma'am, we need to speak with the principal immediately," he said to the receptionist. "Who exactly took the child from this building?" Before Mrs. Gable could answer, the heavy mahogany door to the main office clicked open. Principal Higgins, a tall and usually composed man, stepped out into the lobby holding a thick manila folder. He looked extremely uncomfortable, but he maintained his professional posture. "Mrs. Evans, there is no need for law enforcement," Principal Higgins said, smoothing his tie. "Your daughter is perfectly safe. She left about an hour ago with her grandmother." Patricia presented the proper legal documentation. My hands were tied. "My mother," I whispered, the sheer horror of the situation crashing down on me. "You let my mother walk into this school and take my daughter." Principal Higgins frowned, looking offended by my tone. "She did not just walk in, Mrs. Evans. She arrived with an official emergency family court order granting her temporary guardianship. We are legally obligated to comply with a judge's mandate. She had all the correct county seals and signatures. Show me the papers." Officer Davis ordered, his voice dropping into a dangerous and authoritative register. "Right now." Principal Higgins hesitated for a second before handing the manila folder over to the officer. I leaned over his arm, staring at the documents. There it was, my mother's name printed boldly across the top of a court petition. But the sick twist of the knife came when I looked at the bottom of the page. The filing attorney listed on the paperwork was Trent, my sister's husband. Trent was a notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer who specialized in finding loopholes for wealthy clients. He had used his legal expertise to bypass the local jurisdiction, completely filing an ex parte emergency custody order in a rural, out-of-state county where he had political connections. They claimed I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown and posed an immediate danger to my child. The judge had signed it without even holding a hearing. "This is fraudulent," I screamed, pointing at the signature. "They lied to a judge. They stole my daughter using fake legal pretenses." Officer Davis looked deeply troubled. He closed the folder and turned to me. "Sarah, we need to step into the office and sit down. I need you to explain exactly what is going on here. Why would your own parents file an emergency guardianship order? Why would they go to these extreme lengths to take your child?" I followed him into the principal's office, falling into a leather chair. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably. How could I possibly explain the depth of their betrayal to a stranger? How could I make a police officer understand that my parents were not concerned grandparents trying to protect a child, but calculated predators who had already destroyed my life once before? "They vanished 3 years ago." I began, my voice hollow and trembling. "I have not spoken a single word to Robert or Patricia in 3 entire years. They do not care about Lily. They only care about money." Officer Davis pulled out a notepad. "What money, Sarah? Explain it to me from the beginning." I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath as the agonizing memories flooded back. 4 years ago, my husband Mark was killed in a horrific traffic collision. It was a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate. One minute we were planning our summer vacation, and the next minute I was a widow trying to explain to a 2-year-old little girl why her daddy was never coming home. Mark was a brilliant man. He was careful and responsible. He had a $300,000 life insurance policy to make sure Lily and I would be protected if anything ever happened to him. When the insurance payout finally cleared, I was completely paralyzed by grief. I could barely get out of bed in the morning, let alone manage a massive financial portfolio. That was when my parents stepped in. They played the role of the grieving and supportive family perfectly. Robert and Patricia came to my house every single day. They cooked meals, they played with Lily, they held me while I cried until I could not breathe, and then they made their pitch. Robert sat me down at my kitchen table, holding my hands. He told me that leaving that much cash in a standard savings account was a terrible mistake. He said he had a private investment broker who could put the money into a high-yield trust, ensuring that Lily would have her college fully paid for, and that I would never have to worry about our mortgage. I trusted them completely. They were my flesh and blood. I signed the transfer authorization, giving them temporary managerial control over the funds. I thought I was securing my daughter's future. Officer Davis stopped writing and looked up at me. Let me guess, the money never made it into a trust. I shook my head, wiping a hot tear from my cheek. Not a single dime of it. I spent the next year trying to put the pieces of my shattered life back together. I went back to work at the accounting firm. I threw myself into my job to avoid the crushing silence of my empty house. As an auditor, I am trained to look for discrepancies. One afternoon, about a year after the transfer, I asked my father for the tax documents related to the investment trust. I needed to file my annual returns. He became incredibly defensive. He made excuses saying the broker was traveling and the paperwork was delayed. The excuses continued for weeks. My professional instincts finally kicked in, overriding my blind trust in my family. I pulled the original wire transfer routing numbers from my bank and did a trace on the receiving account. The money had not gone to a licensed broker. It had gone directly into a joint checking account controlled by my mother and my younger sister, Jessica. Jessica was the golden child. She was a beautiful, aspiring socialite who never held a real job in her entire life. She was engaged to Trent at the time, and they were planning a wedding that belonged in a luxury magazine. They rented out an exclusive country club. They hired celebrity floral designers. Jessica wore a custom silk gown that cost more than my first car. They had towering ice sculptures and a 5-course dinner for 300 guests. Everyone in our family marveled at how wealthy Trent must be to afford such a spectacular event. But Trent did not pay for that wedding. Mark paid for it. My dead husband's life insurance policy, the money meant to feed and clothe his orphaned daughter, had been completely drained to fund a $250,000 party for the golden child. When I uncovered the bank statements, I drove straight to my parents' house. I laid the highlighted documents on their expensive granite kitchen counter and demanded an explanation. I expected them to deny it or apologize or show some ounce of remorse. I expected shame, but Patricia simply looked at the papers and sighed like she was dealing with an annoying customer. She told me that Jessica deserved a perfect day. She told me that Mark was gone and the money was not going to bring him back, but Jessica had her whole future ahead of her. Robert stood right beside her, nodding in agreement. He actually had the nerve to tell me that I was young and capable of working to earn the money back, but Jessica needed to make the right impression on Trent's elite family. I threatened to call the police. I threatened to sue them for fraud, but Trent, the corporate lawyer, was already waiting in the living room. He walked in holding a legal brief and smiled at me with pure arrogance. He pointed out that because I had willingly signed the transfer authorization without a legally binding trust agreement in place, the police would view it as a civil matter. He said he would tie me up in litigation for a decade, bleeding me dry with legal fees until I was bankrupt. He told me to walk away and be a good sister. I walked out of that house and never looked back. I changed my locks. I updated my emergency contacts. I worked 60-hour weeks analyzing corporate ledgers and financial records determined to rebuild the safety net they stole from my daughter. For 3 years, they never called. They never sent a birthday card. They ghosted me completely, living their luxurious lives while I scraped together every dollar I could find to give Lily a decent life. So, why are they back now? Officer Davis asked softly, staring at the forged court documents on the principal's desk. If they already stole the money and got away with it, why risk kidnapping a child? I stared at the paperwork, tracing the name of Trent's law firm at the bottom of the page. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. My parents did not care about Lily. They viewed people as resources to be exploited and discarded. If they were taking this kind of massive legal risk, crossing state lines, and lying to a family court judge, it meant they needed something from me right now. They needed something extremely valuable, and they knew the only way to force my compliance was to hold my daughter hostage. Officer Davis picked up his radio again. "We need to issue an Amber Alert immediately. We need to lock down the interstates." "We cannot issue an Amber Alert yet." The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the speaker. "We just ran the paperwork through the national database. The emergency custody order is currently logged as active and valid in the system. Until a judge vacates that order, this is technically a lawful civil custody dispute. The grandmother has legal standing on paper. If we pull her over right now, we have no legal grounds to arrest her." The principal slumped back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. Officer Davis slammed his hand against the mahogany desk, rattling the pen holder. "They weaponized the legal system." I whispered a cold and terrifying realization, freezing the blood in my veins. Trent knows exactly how to manipulate the jurisdiction rules. He filed it in a specific county where the local police cannot simply override a signed judge's order. They have effectively placed an invisible shield around themselves while they transport my daughter across state lines. My phone buzzed in my pocket, violently vibrating against my leg. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen illuminated with a new text message. It was a picture. The image showed Lily sitting in the back seat of a luxury SUV, eating a piece of candy. She looked confused but unharmed. A second message followed immediately after. It was from Robert. The text read, "Do not call the police again, or this gets much worse for everyone. Check your email, Sarah. We have a business proposition for you." I stared at the screen as the true horror of their plan finally settled over me. This was not just a kidnapping born out of spite. This was a calculated and legally insulated extortion plot, orchestrated by a man who knew exactly how to break the law while hiding behind it. My parents had returned from the shadows to take my entire world, and they were daring me to stop them. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the principal office seemed to hum with a sickening electric buzz. My phone felt like a block of solid ice in my palm. The text message from my father was still glowing on the screen, commanding me to check my email for a business proposition. I could hardly breathe. My chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps as the terrifying reality of their plan began to form in my mind. This was not a random act of spite. This was a highly coordinated assault. I tapped the email application icon on my phone. My inbox refreshed, and a new message sat at the very top. It was not sent from my father's personal email address. It was sent from the secure corporate domain of Trent, my golden child sister, wealthy and morally bankrupt husband. The subject line was chilling in its completely emotionless phrasing. It simply read, "Settlement terms regarding minor child." I clicked open the message, and the full scope of their calculated evil stared back at me. Trent did not write like a concerned family member. He wrote with the arrogant, clinical precision of a corporate shark who knew exactly how to corner his prey. The email was heavily padded with legal jargon, but the core message was absolutely crystal clear. He had attached a digitally scanned document of the emergency ex parte custody order. I forced my blurry eyes to focus on the attached file, reading the horrifying paragraphs they had sworn under penalty of perjury. The lies were so extreme, they made my stomach violently churn. They claimed I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown following my husband's death and had turned to severe substance abuse. They claimed I frequently locked Lily in a dark room for days at a time without food or water while I vanished on week-long binges. They painted a picture of a deeply disturbed and violent mother who was an immediate threat to her own child. Trent had meticulously structured the jurisdiction of the filing to completely bypass my local resources. He did not file this emergency petition in our local family court in Chicago, where a judge would easily verify my employment, check my spotless background, and require an immediate interview with me. Instead, Trent had utilized a bizarre and rarely used interstate loophole. He had filed the paperwork in a remote county court in rural Idaho. It was a jurisdiction where his law firm held massive political influence and heavily funded the campaigns of local judges. He had essentially purchased a sympathetic judge who was entirely willing to sign a traumatic emergency removal order without holding a single hearing or asking a single question. By invoking interstate emergency jurisdiction under false pretenses of immediate severe peril, Trent had turned a blatant kidnapping into a fully sanctioned state-authorized maneuver. I handed my phone across the heavy mahogany desk to Officer Davis. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. "Read this," I choked out. "Please, read this. You have to see what they are doing." Officer Davis took the phone. His eyes scanned the screen and his jaw tightened into a hard, rigid line. I watched his face shift from professional determination to deep, frustrated anger. He immediately picked up his shoulder radio and called his precinct captain, stepping out into the hallway to speak in hushed, urgent tones. Through the glass window of the door, I watched him pacing, running his hand over his close-cropped hair. When he walked back into the principal office 10 minutes later, the look in his eyes made my entire world collapse. "Sarah, I am so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "My captain just got off the phone with the district attorney office. Because this involves an active signed order from a sitting judge in another state, our local police department has absolutely no authority to intervene right now. We cannot issue an Amber Alert. We cannot authorize a highway patrol intercept." I stared at him in utter disbelief. "What are you talking about?" I cried out, my voice breaking. "They lied to a judge. They forged these allegations. My mother just abducted my child from her school." "You're the police. You have to stop them." Officer Davis rubbed the back of his neck, looking thoroughly miserable. "I know they lied, Sarah. Any reasonable person looking at this can see it is a coordinated setup, but the law operates on procedure, not intuition. If state troopers pull your mother over on the highway right now, she will simply hand them that court order. The troopers will run it through the national database, see that it is active, and they will be legally required to let her drive away with your daughter. The system assumes a judge has already verified the facts before signing the removal. Until a family court invalidates that specific piece of paper, this is considered a civil custody dispute. My hands are completely tied. The words felt like a physical death sentence. The local police could not help me. The school administration had already washed their hands of the situation. I was entirely alone. I looked back down at the email on my phone, forcing myself to read the rest of Trent demands. The custody order was just the weapon. The real objective was outlined in the second half of the message. 4 years ago, when my husband Mark passed away, my parents had managed to steal the initial $300,000 life insurance payout because I had foolishly granted them temporary access to my accounts during my grief. But they did not know about Mark's secondary corporate trust fund at the time. Mark had been a brilliant software developer who secured a highly profitable patent early in his career. That patent generated a substantial residual income that fed directly into a heavily guarded family trust, meant exclusively for Lily Future. The trust was currently valued at just over $2 million. Unlike the life insurance payout, my parents could not simply trick me into signing a standard banking authorization for this trust. The money was locked behind strict legal safeguards that required my direct sworn signature in the presence of corporate attorneys to release the funds. For 3 years, my parents had been watching that account grow from a distance, completely unable to touch it. Now they had found a way to force my hand. Trent email laid out the ransom with sickening clarity. He provided routing instructions for a newly established nonprofit organization called the Jessica Vance Charitable Foundation. It was a supposedly philanthropic venture run entirely by my golden child sister. The demand was absolute. I was to sign the trust transfer documents and wire the entire $2 million to Jessica Foundation by Friday morning. If I complied with the financial transfer, Trent promised to immediately file a motion to dismiss the emergency custody order. They would claim that our family had reached a miraculous private reconciliation, and my mother would return Lily to my front door unharmed. But if I refused to sign, Trent outlined a nightmare scenario that made my blood run completely cold. He boasted about his law firm, endless financial resources, and their deep connections within the interstate court system. If I tried to fight them, he promised to drag the litigation out for years. He would request endless continuances, psychological evaluations, and venue changes. He warned me that while the court slowly unraveled the jurisdiction mess, Lily would remain hidden out of state. She would be placed in temporary foster care or held in a remote compound under my mother's supervision while I slowly bankrupted myself paying defense attorneys. I would miss her 7th birthday. I would miss her 8th birthday. She would grow up believing that her mother had abandoned her because that is exactly what they would tell her every single day. "You have 48 hours to make the right choice," Sarah Trent wrote at the bottom of the email. "Do not let your stubborn pride ruin your daughter's life. We are prepared to go the distance. Are you?" I sat in the quiet office listening to the faint sound of school children laughing out on the playground. The contrast between their innocent joy and the pure evil unfolding on my phone screen was absolutely unbearable. The maternal instinct inside me was screaming to just give them the money. $2 million was a staggering amount of wealth, but it meant absolutely nothing compared to the safety of my child. I would burn every dollar I had to ashes just to hold her in my arms again. But as I sat there, staring at the routing numbers for my sister's fake charitable foundation, a different part of my brain slowly began to wake up. I am a senior financial auditor. I spend 60 hours a week hunting down corporate embezzlement, dismantling shell companies, and exposing executives who think they are clever enough to hide their stolen assets. I have taken down millionaires who thought they were entirely untouchable. I know how greedy people operate. And more importantly, I know that extortionists never simply walk away. If I signed over that $2 million, what guarantee did I have that they would actually return Lily? They had already proven they were willing to commit perjury, falsify emergency court orders, and abduct a child. If I gave them the money, they would just have $2 million and my daughter. They could easily demand my house next. They could demand my future wages. Once you pay a blackmailer, you do not buy your freedom. You only fund their next attack. A strange and profound silence washed over me. The blinding panic that had paralyzed my chest began to recede, replaced by a cold, highly calculated focus. The tears stopped falling. My breathing slowed down. They thought they were dealing with the same heartbroken, naive widow they had easily robbed 3 years ago. They thought I was just a weak, emotional mother who would crumble under the weight of their aggressive legal threats. But they had made one catastrophic mistake in their flawless extortion plan. They left a paper trail. By sending a documented demand for a $2 million wire transfer, in exchange for dropping a custody suit, Trent had crossed a massive legal threshold. He was no longer just playing dirty family court games. He had officially stepped into the realm of federal interstate extortion and wire fraud. I looked up at Officer Davis. He was watching me with an expression of deep sympathy, clearly expecting me to completely fall apart. He had seen countless parents shatter under the impossible weight of a broken justice system. "Officer Davis," I asked, my voice perfectly steady and clear, if I wanted to report a multi-million-dollar interstate extortion plot involving a licensed attorney and a fraudulent charitable foundation, local police would not handle that correct. He blinked clearly, taken aback by the sudden shift in my demeanor. "No, Mom," he replied slowly. "That kind of high-level financial crime would be completely out of our jurisdiction. You would need to take that directly to the federal authorities. You would need the FBI." I nodded slowly, closing my phone and sliding it back into my pocket. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate you coming out here today." I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my skirt. I did not feel like a terrified victim anymore. I felt like an auditor who had just found the loose thread in a corrupt company ledger. My parents and my golden child sister had taken my daughter believing their fancy lawyer could protect them from any consequences. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. But they were about to learn a very painful lesson about corners. When you back a mother into one, you should never assume she is going to surrender. You should prepare for her to tear the entire building down. The drive back to my empty house was a miserable blur of gray asphalt and driving rain. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached with a dull throbbing pain, but the blinding panic that had utterly consumed me inside the principal office was slowly beginning to burn away. In its place, a cold and terrifying clarity began to settle over my mind. They thought they had completely broken me. My parents and my golden child sister truly believed that by stealing my 6-year-old daughter, they could force me to blindly sign away $2 million. They banked entirely on my maternal desperation. They expected me to collapse on my living room floor and weep until I surrendered to their extortion demands. But they forgot exactly who I am. I am not just a grieving widow or a helpless single mother desperately trying to keep her head above water. I am a senior financial auditor. For nearly a decade, I have made my living dismantling complex corporate frauds, tracing hidden offshore accounts, and exposing wealthy executives who thought they were entirely invincible. I know exactly how greedy people think. I know that extreme arrogance always breeds carelessness. And I know that every single criminal, no matter how smart they believe they are, leaves a permanent paper trail. I walked through my front door and locked the heavy brass deadbolt behind me. The silence of the house, usually filled with the bright sound of Lily playing in the hallway, was absolutely deafening. The sheer emptiness threatened to crack my fragile resolve, but I shoved the raw emotion down deep into my chest. There would be plenty of time to cry later. Right now, my daughter did not need a weeping mother. She needed a professional investigator. I walked straight up into my home office and booted up my secure dual-monitor workstation. I pulled up the extortion email Trent had sent me. I connected my secure phone to the laser printer and watched as the forged emergency custody order and the demanding wire transfer instructions slid out of the machine page by page. I laid the crisp white sheets of paper out across my large mahogany desk edge positioning them exactly how I would set up a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation at my corporate firm. Rage is a completely useless emotion when you are fighting a high-stakes war. Rage makes you sloppy and impulsive. It makes you blind to the subtle structural inconsistencies that can tear an entire extortion plot to the ground. I grabbed a red pen and leaned over the documents, forcing my brain to detach from the personal trauma and view my own family members as hostile corporate targets. I started with the emergency custody order. Trent had clearly drafted the petition himself, using his elite legal expertise to manipulate a vulnerable rural family court system. The formatting was flawless, and the legal citations were completely airtight. He had intentionally chosen an obscure out-of-state jurisdiction where his massive corporate law firm held significant political sway, making sure the local police back in Chicago could not simply intervene and arrest my mother. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, designed to create an impenetrable jurisdictional shield around my parents while they held my child hostage across state lines. But an experienced auditor does not just look at what is written on the page. We look for what is deliberately missing. I moved my attention to the second document, which contained the formal demand letter outlining the $2 million wire transfer. Trent had demanded that the entire balance of Mark Secure Family Trust be immediately liquidated and wired to a financial entity called the Jessica Vance Charitable Foundation. According to his beautifully drafted email, this foundation was a registered nonprofit organization completely dedicated to supporting underprivileged youth programs. He claimed the transfer would be processed legally as a tax-deductible charitable donation, effectively laundering the stolen money right under the nose of the federal government while making themselves look like philanthropists. It was an incredibly bold and disgusting strategy. It was also the exact moment my red pen stopped moving across the paper. I stared at the banking routing numbers provided at the bottom of the page. Something was fundamentally and structurally wrong. In the highly regulated financial world, charitable foundations use very specific banking clearinghouses. They are legally required to maintain transparent operating accounts, usually held by established institutional banks with strict federal oversight and compliance monitoring. But the routing number Trent had provided did not belong to a major institutional bank. It belonged to a regional credit union operating out of a small commercial district known specifically for handling rapid real estate transactions and shielding private investors. I opened my secure auditing software and ran a trace on the routing and account numbers. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, pulling encrypted data from federal banking registries and corporate filing databases. I bypassed the standard public searches that anyone could access and logged into the deeper financial networks I regularly used for my high-level corporate clients. The verified results popped up on my right monitor, and a grim, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. The receiving account did not belong to the Jessica Vance Charitable Foundation at all. The charity was nothing but a fake front, a phantom name used to dress up the extortion demand and manipulate the banking system. The actual bank account tied to those specific routing numbers was registered to a limited liability company called Apex Horizon Holdings. Trent had gotten greedy. He was a brilliant and ruthless lawyer, but he was a terrible accountant. He assumed a desperate and terrified mother would just blindly hand the paperwork to her local bank manager and authorize the transfer without ever verifying the receiving institution. He never expected me to run a forensic digital trace on his drop account. Apex Horizon Holdings. I whispered the cold corporate name aloud in the empty room. I opened a new encrypted search window and began pulling the state tax filings and corporate registration documents for the shell company. I needed to know who exactly was pulling the financial strings behind this invisible curtain. The corporate registry listed a generic registered agent in Delaware, which is completely standard for shell companies trying to hide the identities of their true owners. But the annual franchise tax payments told a completely different and illuminating story. The complex tax documents showed that Apex Horizon Holdings had been actively purchasing distressed real estate properties for the past 2 years. But the property taxes for those acquisitions were being paid through a secondary holding account. I traced that secondary account through a maze of wire transfers directly back to Trent Personal Wealth Management Firm. He was actively using the shell company to hide his own private real estate acquisitions away from his senior law firm partners and attempting to hide the assets from the Internal Revenue Service. But I needed more than just financial connections and wire fraud evidence. I needed a physical location. I needed to know exactly where my mother had taken Lily. I turned my intense focus back to the original extortion email displaying on my phone. Criminals, especially wealthy, arrogant ones, who truly believe they are above the law, rarely cover their digital footprints perfectly. They rely heavily on commercial encryption software and secure servers, but they almost always leave a digital backdoor wide open. I pulled the raw header data from the email message. The header contains the exact routing information of the communication, including the originating Internet Protocol address. Trent had attempted to use a virtual private network to mask his location, bouncing his signal through a proxy server in Europe. But he had made one massive fatal error in his technological execution. He had attached the scanned PDF of the forged court order directly from his personal tablet. The metadata embedded deep within that specific PDF document contained the unmasked location data of the exact local router where the scan had actually taken place. I extracted the latitude and longitude coordinates and ran them through a high-resolution geographic mapping program. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as the progress bar slowly loaded across the screen. The satellite map zoomed out of Chicago, moving steadily northwest across the country. It bypassed the state lines, passing over sprawling highways and deep green forests, until it finally stopped dropping a bright red digital pin in the rugged, mountainous region of western Montana. I stared at the detailed satellite imagery illuminating my monitor. The location was incredibly remote. It was not a luxury hotel or a secure legal compound. The red pin was sitting directly on a heavily wooded plot of land, miles away from the nearest paved main road. I quickly cross-referenced the exact GPS coordinates with the property deeds owned by Apex Horizon Holdings. A perfect verifiable match appeared on my screen. The shell company owned an isolated foreclosed hunting cabin located deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a secluded property Trent had quietly purchased at a massive discount 6 months ago using his hidden funds. The cabin had no immediate neighbors. It was surrounded entirely by dense pine trees and rough, unforgiving terrain. It was the absolute perfect place to hide a stolen child while extorting her vulnerable mother for $2 million. The sheer reality of the situation made the blood in my veins run completely cold. My mother, a woman who spent her entire life attending high society luncheons and obsessing over country club status, was currently sitting in a damp, foreclosed hunting cabin in the middle of absolute nowhere, acting as a brutal warden for her own innocent granddaughter. And Trent, the arrogant legal mastermind, was directing the entire illegal operation from behind his polished mahogany desk, safe in his downtown office. They thought they were invisible. They thought they had buried themselves beneath so many complex layers of legal protection and corporate shell companies that no local police department would ever be able to untangle the mess in time to save Lily. They were absolutely right about the local police. The local authorities were bound tightly by jurisdiction lines and forged custody orders. They could not touch Trent, and they could not legally raid a cabin 3 states away without spending months fighting through bureaucratic red tape and judicial appeals. But I was not relying on the local police anymore. I leaned back in my heavy office chair, staring at the mountain of damning evidence spread across my desk. I had the forged court documents proving perjury. I had the fraudulent wire transfer instructions attempting to launder $2 million across state lines. I had the direct, undeniable financial link between the extortion demand and Trent hidden corporate shell company. And now I had the exact physical coordinates of the isolated mountain cabin where they were holding my daughter hostage. Trent had built a seemingly perfect trap, but his overwhelming arrogance and greed had left the door completely wide open. He had taken what should have been a dirty civil family court dispute and recklessly escalated it into federal wire fraud, interstate extortion, and a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme. I picked up my secure phone. My hands were no longer shaking. The terrified, broken mother who had collapsed on the school steps was gone, entirely replaced by a woman who was about to burn their entire criminal empire to the absolute ground. I did not need to negotiate with my abusers. I did not need to beg for my daughter life. I just needed to make one phone call to the people who actively handle white-collar criminals and interstate kidnappers. I needed the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The adrenaline that had spiked through my veins upon locating the isolated Montana cabin slowly gave way to a cold and terrifying logic. I sat perfectly still in the dim glow of my dual monitors, listening to the steady hum of my computer tower. I had the geographic coordinates. I knew exactly where my mother was holding my 6-year-old daughter. But in the world of forensic auditing, knowing where the assets are hidden is only half the battle. You have to understand why they were moved in the first place. Extortion and interstate kidnapping are not crimes committed by comfortable people. My parents and my golden child sister Jessica lived incredibly comfortable lives. They belonged to an exclusive suburban country club. They drove imported luxury cars and hosted catered garden parties that cost more than my annual salary. Trent was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. People with that level of social status and financial security do not suddenly abduct a child and forge emergency custody documents just to settle an old family grudge. They only take those kinds of catastrophic risks when they are facing total and complete destruction. I needed to know what kind of destruction was chasing them. I needed to know why they were demanding exactly $2 million and why they needed it wired to a fraudulent charity account by this coming Friday morning. I turned my attention back to the primary keyboard. I opened a dedicated secure browser and navigated directly to the Internal Revenue Service public portal for tax-exempt organizations. Every registered nonprofit in the United States is legally required to file an annual disclosure document known as a Form 990. These documents are public record intended to ensure that charities are actually using their donations for philanthropic purposes, rather than enriching their board members. I typed the name of my sister organization into the search bar. The Jessica Caldwell Charitable Foundation. The search results populated, immediately displaying 3 years of comprehensive tax filings. I downloaded the heavy digital files and opened them side by side on my widescreen monitor. I began to read through the columns and line items, applying the exact same relentless scrutiny I used to dismantle corrupt corporate clients. For the past 3 years, my sister had leveraged her position in elite social circles to transform herself into a celebrated local philanthropist. According to her perfectly curated social media accounts, she threw lavish black tie galas, silent auctions, and $10,000 a plate charity dinners. She convinced her wealthy country club friends and her husband, powerful legal colleagues, to write massive tax-deductible checks under the guise of funding underprivileged youth programs and building community centers. But numbers tell a highly specific story that social media filters can never hide. As I traced her reported income against her listed expenditures, the polished illusion of the golden child completely evaporated. In its first year of operation, the foundation took in roughly $1.5 million in charitable donations. The forms claimed that a vast majority of those funds were dispersed as community grants. But when I cross-referenced the employer identification numbers of the organizations receiving those grants, they were not community centers or youth programs. They were secondary shell companies, managed entirely by Trent Law Firm. They were billing the charity hundreds of thousands of dollars for arbitrary consulting fees, administrative oversight, and legal retainers. By the second and third years, the embezzlement became even more brazen and recklessly arrogant. The foundation had taken in over $5 million from wealthy donors who simply wanted a tax write-off and a reason to dress up for a gala. But the foundation bank accounts were being systematically bled dry. Trent and Jessica were using the charity as their own personal piggy bank, routing the stolen funds through Apex Horizon Holdings to purchase remote real estate, luxury vehicles, and designer wardrobes. They were living like royalty on stolen money, assuming that because Trent was a brilliant attorney, he could hide the massive financial deficit forever. They had effectively created a highly sophisticated country club Ponzi scheme, but every single scheme eventually runs out of other people money. I stared at the staggering math, calculating the exact current deficit based on their reported assets versus their actual verifiable disbursements. The final number glowing on my spreadsheet made my breath catch in my throat. They were exactly $2 million short. The exact amount of money my late husband had placed in a secure trust for our daughter. The exact amount of money Trent was currently demanding I wire to them by Friday morning. But a financial deficit alone does not explain the sheer violent desperation of a kidnapping. Corporate and proper embezzlers can juggle missing funds for years by falsifying ledgers and opening new lines of credit. There had to be an immediate impending trigger. Something was forcing them to produce that missing $2 million right now. I minimized the tax documents and opened a portal to the federal court electronic records database. It is a system used by legal professionals and auditors to track civil and criminal dockets across the country. If Trent was in trouble, the paper trail would be quietly building in the background of the federal justice system. I ran a sweeping search matrix using Trent name his law firm, the foundation, and his registered shell companies. I filtered out standard civil litigation and focused entirely on federal inquiries. For several minutes, the database returned absolutely nothing. Then, I refined my search parameters to include sealed or recently unsealed motions in the federal district court. A single heavily redacted docket number appeared on my screen. It was filed by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, jointly with the Department of Justice. My eyes scanned the grim legal text, and the entire terrifying picture finally snapped into perfect focus. 3 weeks ago, the federal government had launched a comprehensive audit of the Jessica Caldwell Charitable Foundation based on a tip regarding severe financial irregularities. The Department of Justice had issued a sweeping federal subpoena demanding that Trent and Jessica produce their unredacted financial ledgers, their internal communications, and proof of their liquid charity balances. The federal prosecutors were explicitly looking for the missing $2 million. The deadline listed on the federal court order for the foundation to surrender their banking records and prove the charity funds were fully intact was this coming Friday at exactly noon. I slumped back in my heavy leather office chair, my mind reeling from the sheer magnitude of their criminal exposure. They were not just facing a minor tax penalty or a civil lawsuit from angry, wealthy donors. They were staring down the barrel of massive federal indictments for wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and interstate embezzlement. If they did not have $2 million sitting in that charity bank account by Friday morning, the federal auditors would instantly see the massive gaping hole in their ledgers. The illusion would completely shatter. Trent would be immediately stripped of his law license, disgraced in front of his senior partners, and sentenced to a decade in a federal penitentiary. Jessica would lose her country club membership, her luxury home, and her freedom trading her designer silk gowns for a standard-issue prison jumpsuit. My parents, who had undoubtedly signed their names as active board members for the fraudulent charity, would be charged as criminal co-conspirators and die in a federal facility. They were absolutely terrified. They were desperate cornered animals, watching the clock tick down to their own total destruction. That was why they orchestrated the emergency custody order. That was why they took the incredible risk of crossing state lines to snatch my daughter from her school. Lily was never the target. My mother did not want to raise a 6-year-old child. My parents did not care about my parenting abilities. Lily was simply the most effective human shield they could find. They needed my dead husband trust fund to plug the gaping hole in their stolen charity accounts before the federal government kicked their front doors down. They were attempting to use my innocent daughter to buy their way out of federal prison. The profound danger my daughter was in suddenly amplified by 1,000. Cornered criminals with nothing left to lose are completely unpredictable. If I refused to pay them, they would be destroyed on Friday anyway, and they might take their rage out on the only leverage they possessed. If I called their bluff and confronted them directly, they might attempt to move Lily to an even more remote and dangerous location. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was currently Wednesday evening. I had roughly 36 hours before their federal deadline expired. I could not simply jump in my car and drive to the mountains of Montana. If I showed up at that isolated cabin alone, I would be walking directly into a trap set by desperate people who had already proven they were willing to commit extreme felonies to protect their own lifestyle. I could not rely on the local police because Trent had meticulously wrapped this entire extortion plot in a thick layer of fabricated civil custody paperwork that local cops could not legally pierce. But Trent made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed I would react like a terrified, submissive daughter. He assumed I would frantically call my local bank and drain my child's future to save her life. He completely forgot that I spend my entire life working alongside specialized attorneys, building airtight cases against financial predators. By demanding a $2 million wire transfer to cover up a federal embezzlement scheme using a kidnapped child as leverage, Trent had handed me the absolute perfect weapon. I did not need to fight his fake family court order in a rural county jurisdiction. I just needed to hand the entire extortion package over to the exact people who were already hunting him. I reached for my secure phone and pulled up my private contact list. I scrolled past the local police precinct and stopped on a number I had acquired during a massive corporate fraud investigation 2 years ago. It was the direct mobile number for a senior special agent in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my emotions down into a cold and untouchable box. I had to play the most dangerous game of my life. I had to make my parents and my sister believe that their cruel manipulation was working flawlessly. I had to convince them that I was a broken, weeping mess, completely willing to sign away $2 million on Friday morning. I needed to keep them utterly distracted and feeling victorious while the federal authorities quietly moved into position around that Montana cabin. I dialed the special agent number and listened to it ring in the quiet darkness of my office. They wanted to use my daughter as a pawn in their financial crimes. They wanted to destroy my life to save their own. But they were about to learn that the quiet, reliable scapegoat they had abused for decades was the one person who could orchestrate their absolute and permanent ruin. The blue light of my dual monitors reflected off the polished wood of my desk. I gathered the printed documents one by one: the forged emergency custody order, the fraudulent wire transfer instructions for the Jessica Caldwell Charitable Foundation, the federal subpoena from the Internal Revenue Service, the exact geographic coordinates of the isolated hunting cabin in Montana. I stacked them together into a single thick manila folder. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a fully documented federal crime. I picked up my secure mobile phone and scrolled to a number I had saved 2 years ago during a massive corporate embezzlement investigation. Special Agent David Reynolds worked in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation right here in Chicago. We had spent 6 months dismantling a corrupt supply chain company together. He respected my analytical skills, and I respected his absolute relentless pursuit of justice. I dialed the number. It rang 3 times before his deep, gravelly voice answered the line. "David," I said, forcing my voice to remain completely steady. "I need your help." "Sarah," he replied, sounding surprised but immediately alert. "It is late. Is everything all right with the firm?" "It is not the firm," I told him, gripping the edge of my desk. "It is personal." My daughter was abducted from her school this afternoon. The people who took her are currently using a forged state court order to shield themselves from the local police. They are holding her in a foreclosed hunting cabin in western Montana, and they are demanding I wire $2 million to a fraudulent charity account by Friday morning. The line went completely dead for a few seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background on his end before it was abruptly muted. "Where are you right now?" David asked, his voice stripped of all casual warmth and replaced entirely by cold professional authority. "I am at my house," I said. "I have a complete evidentiary package. I have proof of the wire fraud, the shell company they are using to hide the real estate, the fake charity, and the impending federal audit that triggered this entire extortion plot. The man orchestrating this is a senior corporate attorney. He thinks he has manipulated the jurisdiction perfectly to keep the local authorities frozen. Bring everything to the downtown field office immediately," David commanded. "I will have a team waiting for you. Do not contact the kidnappers. Do not alert local dispatch. Just get here." I grabbed my car keys and walked out into the cool night air. The drive into downtown Chicago was a blur of neon lights and dark, wet pavement. My mind was operating at 1,000 miles an hour, analyzing every single variable. Trent and my parents had vastly underestimated my professional reach. They viewed me as the weak, submissive daughter they could bully into submission. They never bothered to learn that my career was built on sending men exactly like Trent to federal prison. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of the federal building. A junior agent was waiting for me at the security checkpoint. He escorted me up an unlisted elevator to a restricted floor. The atmosphere in the white-collar division was intensely quiet. There were no ringing phones or loud conversations, just the steady hum of servers and the sharp focus of people who hunted predators for a living. David was waiting for me in a stark glass-walled conference room. He had 3 other agents with him, including a hostage rescue specialist named Agent Vargas. I sat down at the steel table and opened my manila folder. I did not waste a single second on tears or emotional exposition. I walked them through the money trail exactly the way I would brief a corporate board of directors. I laid out the fraudulent wire instructions, pointing out the regional credit union routing numbers. I showed them the shell company registration for Apex Horizon Holdings and traced the franchise tax payments directly back to Trent personal wealth management accounts. I provided the satellite imagery of the Montana hunting cabin, tying the property deed to the same shell company. And finally, I slid the Internal Revenue Service docket across the table, revealing the impending Friday deadline for the federal audit of my sister, fake charity. "They are $2 million short," I explained, looking around the table at the federal agents. "Trent and Jessica have been bleeding their charity dry to fund their luxury lifestyle. The Department of Justice is demanding to see their fully funded ledgers by Friday at noon. If they do not have that exact amount sitting in the account, they are going to federal prison for a very long time. That is the only reason they took my daughter. They need my late husband trust fund to replace the stolen money." David picked up the forged emergency custody order and shook his head in absolute disgust. He used his law license to file a fraudulent ex parte order in a compromised rural county. He basically generated a fake permission slip to traffic a child across state lines, believing it would tie up the local police long enough for the extortion to clear. It is brilliant, but it is incredibly reckless. "Can you secure the cabin?" I asked, turning to Agent Vargas. "I know exactly where she is." "We can," Agent Vargas said, leaning forward. "The location is isolated, which actually works to our advantage. They will not see a tactical team approaching through the tree line. But we have a major logistical problem, Sarah. We cannot move on that cabin until we are absolutely certain Trent and your parents are completely distracted and separated from your daughter. If we raid the property and they get a warning phone call from a lookout, they might panic. We need them feeling perfectly safe and entirely victorious, right up until the handcuffs click shut." "How do we do that?" I asked. David folded his hands on the table. "We need you to take the bait. You have to convince them that their cruel manipulation has completely broken your spirit. We need you to call your mother right now and give her the performance of a lifetime. You have to agree to their extortion terms and set up a physical meeting to sign the final transfer documents. We need them in one room here in Chicago, while our tactical team quietly secures your daughter in Montana." A cold chill washed over my arms. I had spent the last 3 years building ironclad boundaries, protecting myself from my mother's toxic emotional abuse. Now I had to voluntarily step right back into the role of the terrified scapegoat. I had to let them believe they had crushed me. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, set up the recording equipment. I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I will make the call." The agents quickly attached a digital audio tap to my phone line. David gave me a silent nod. I closed my eyes and let my mind slip back to the dark, miserable years of my childhood. I remembered the feeling of constant inadequacy. I remembered the day they stole my life insurance money and told me I was being selfish for complaining. I took all of that suppressed pain and pushed it right to the surface of my throat. I forced my breathing to become erratic. I let hot, frustrated tears spill over my eyelashes. I dialed my mother number. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice came through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone of artificial concern. "Sarah, darling," she said, acting as if she had not just abducted my child hours earlier. "I am so glad you decided to be reasonable and call us back." "Mom," I sobbed, letting my voice crack violently. "Please, Mom. Please just give her back to me. She is just a little girl. She does not understand what is happening. She needs to be at home." My mother sighed heavily, a deeply condescending sound that made my skin crawl. "Do not be dramatic, Sarah. Lily is having a wonderful time on a little family vacation. We are just spending some quality time with our granddaughter. It is such a shame you have been completely neglecting her lately. The courts were very disturbed to hear about your mental state." I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my fingernails into my palms to keep myself from screaming at her. She was actively gaslighting me while holding my child hostage. "I am not neglecting her," I cried, forcing panic into my words. "Please, that is a lie. I will do whatever you want." I read the email. "I will sign the papers. Just tell me what I have to do." I could hear the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone line. She had won. The difficult, rebellious daughter had finally been broken and brought to heel. "That is the right choice, Sarah," she purred. "We knew you would eventually see reason. This is truly for the best. Jessica Foundation does such wonderful work for the community, and you have always been so selfish with your resources. It is time you finally contributed to this family." I swallowed a wave of pure bile. "Yes, Mom," I whimpered. "You are right. I will give Jessica the money. Just tell me where to bring the trust documents." There was a brief, muffled sound on the other end of the line. I heard my mother whispering to someone. A moment later, the tone of the call shifted and Trent's voice came through the speaker. He sounded incredibly arrogant, his words clipped and authoritative. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," Trent commanded. "You are going to bring the original trust authorization forms and your state identification to my downtown law office on Friday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. You will sign the direct wire transfer in the presence of my senior notary. We will route the $2 million to the foundation. Once the Federal Banking Clearinghouse confirms the funds have hit our account, I will file a motion to dismiss the emergency custody order." "What about Lily?" I asked, sobbing loudly into the receiver. "When do I get to see my daughter?" Trent laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Assuming you follow instructions perfectly and do not try anything stupid, your mother will personally drive Lily back to your house on Friday evening. But let me be absolutely clear, Sarah. If you bring a lawyer to this meeting, the deal is entirely off. If you contact the local police, I will immediately initiate proceedings to terminate your parental rights permanently, and Lily will remain in protective state custody out of your reach for years. Do you fully understand me? Yes, I cried out, my voice shaking with fabricated terror. Yes, I understand, Trent. Please do not hurt her. I will be there on Friday. I will sign everything. Just do not take her away from me. 10 o'clock. Trent repeated, his tone dripping with absolute victory. Do not be late. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to the steel table. I took a deep breath, pulling a tissue from my pocket and wiping the tears from my face. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The performance was over. David looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine professional respect. That was flawless, he said quietly. They bought every single second of it. They think they have you completely trapped. They are going to be waiting for me in his law firm on Friday morning, I said, looking at the audio recording device. They want me to sign the wire transfer in his own conference room, surrounded by his colleagues. Agent Vargas nodded, pulling out a tactical map of the Montana mountain range. The trap is officially set. While they are busy gloating in Chicago, my team will deploy to the Bitterroot Mountains. We will approach the hunting cabin before dawn on Friday and secure the perimeter. We will not breach the doors until you are physically inside the law firm, making sure they have zero opportunity to communicate with whoever is guarding your daughter. And what happens when I walk into that boardroom? I asked, looking directly at David. David offered a cold, predatory smile. You are going to walk in there and play their little game, just long enough for us to confirm your daughter is safe. Once we give you the green light, you are going to show them exactly what happens when they try to extort a federal auditor. And then, my team is going to walk through those glass doors and arrest every single one of them for interstate kidnapping, extortion, wire fraud, and federal conspiracy. I drove home that night feeling a strange, unnatural calm settling into my bones. The fear that had paralyzed me on the school steps was completely gone. My parents and my golden child sister had pushed me for my entire life. They had taken my savings, mocked my lifestyle, and treated me like a disposable asset. Now, they had crossed the ultimate line by taking my innocent child. They thought Friday morning was going to be their ultimate triumph. They thought I was going to hand over a $2 million lifeline to save them from a federal prison sentence. They had no idea that I was not bringing them a lifeline. I was bringing them an anchor, and I was going to watch them drown. The clock was ticking toward Friday, and I was perfectly ready to walk straight into the lion den. Friday morning arrived with a bleak and bruised gray sky hanging heavily over the city of Chicago. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, actively destroying my own reflection. I needed to look like a woman who had not slept in 3 entire days. I needed to look entirely defeated. I rubbed the makeup beneath my eyes to create dark, heavy circles. I put on a slightly wrinkled blouse. I deliberately messed up my hair and practiced the visible trembling in my hands. The physical toll of the extortion had to look absolutely authentic. Trent and my mother were predators, and predators can instantly smell confidence. If I walked into that luxurious downtown law firm looking like a senior financial auditor ready for a boardroom war, they would immediately know something was wrong. And if they suspected a trap, one quick phone call to a burner phone in Montana could make my little girl disappear forever. I had been briefed on the federal operation protocol late Thursday night. Special Agent David Reynolds and the hostage rescue specialist Agent Vargas had laid out the exact timeline. Federal agents do not simply kick down doors blindly when a 6-year-old child is trapped inside. They had spent the last 12 hours utilizing high-altitude thermal imaging drones to map the exact layout of the isolated hunting cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. They had confirmed the heat signatures inside the structure. There were 2 adults and 1 small child. My parents were not at the remote cabin. They were waiting for me right here in Chicago, sitting comfortably in a high-rise office, expecting to collect a $2 million wire transfer. The people holding Lily were hired muscle. They were disposable accomplices. Trent had likely paid out of his dwindling, embezzled charity funds to do the dirty work across state lines. I poured a cup of black coffee in my quiet suburban kitchen, imagining the scene unfolding 2,000 miles away. I pictured the highly trained federal agents moving silently through the dense pine trees, their boots stepping softly against the freezing morning frost. They were heavily armed and wearing tactical gear, surrounding the perimeter of a property bought with stolen money and hidden behind a corrupt corporate shell company. The sheer tension of knowing this militarized operation was happening simultaneously while I stood alone in my empty house was enough to make my stomach violently churn. The synchronization of the two events had to be absolutely flawless. I grabbed the thick manila folder containing the forged court documents, the fake wire transfer authorization, and the federal indictment papers I had uncovered. I walked out to my car and started the engine. The drive into the city was completely excruciating. The morning traffic on the expressway crawled at an agonizing, miserable pace. Every single time the red brake lights flared in front of my windshield, my chest tightened painfully. I glanced at the digital clock on my dashboard over and over again. It was 8:45 in the morning. Trent had demanded I arrive at his senior partner conference room at 10 o'clock sharp. The timeline was everything. Agent Vargas had explicitly told me that the tactical team would wait until the very last possible second to breach the heavy wooden doors of the cabin. They needed Trent and my mother to feel completely secure and totally victorious. The federal agents wanted my abusers sitting comfortably in their glass-walled conference room, entirely focused on the incoming $2 million trust fund payout. If the tactical team hit the mountain cabin too early, the local accomplices might manage to send out a frantic distress signal. A single panicked text message to Trent's personal cell phone would blow the entire federal operation wide open. My specific job was to serve as the ultimate distraction. I had to command their full attention while the trap snapped shut. My knuckles were bone white against the leather steering wheel as I navigated through the busy downtown streets. The towering glass skyscrapers cast long dark shadows over the pavement. I was driving straight into the heart of Trent professional empire. He had built his entire identity on corporate intimidation and legal loopholes. He truly believed that his law degree and his expensive suits made him entirely untouchable. He believed that he could use the family court system to traffic my child and force me into a massive financial surrender without facing a single repercussion. I pulled into the underground parking structure beneath the massive corporate law building at exactly 9:30. The concrete walls of the subterranean garage felt like a cold, damp tomb. I parked my car in a designated visitor space and turned off the ignition. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening. I stared at my secure mobile phone sitting perfectly still on the passenger seat. The screen was completely black. The physical and emotional pain of waiting for the federal signal was totally indescribable. My entire existence was narrowed down to that small rectangular device. What if something went wrong in the freezing mountains of Montana? What if the hired accomplices were heavily armed and panicked when the federal agents breached the perimeter? What if my precious little girl got caught in the violent crossfire? A terrifying wave of raw maternal instinct screamed at me to just call Trent right now and beg for absolute mercy. A voice in my head begged me to just sign the papers and give them the $2 million to guarantee her safety. But the seasoned auditor inside me, the woman who had spent a decade dismantling corporate criminals, held her ground. Extortionists do not return the hostage when you pay them. They just demand more. I had to trust the evidence I had uncovered. I had to trust the federal agents currently standing in the snow. I had to sit in the dark and wait. The minutes dragged by like actual hours. 9:35, 9:38, 9:40. Every time I heard a car door slam somewhere in the parking garage, my heart jumped into my throat. I visualized Trent sitting in his plush leather chair, sipping expensive sparkling water, casually looking at his gold watch. I visualized my mother, Sandra, applying fresh lipstick in the lobby restroom, preparing to play the role of the concerned grandmother who had miraculously rescued a child from an unfit parent. They were so arrogant. They were so completely blind to their own impending destruction. At exactly 9:42, the screen of my mobile phone suddenly illuminated, casting a bright blue glow across the dim interior of my car. A single encrypted text message appeared from Special Agent David Reynolds. I snatched the device up with violently trembling fingers, holding my breath as I read the words on the screen. The message was incredibly brief and clinically precise. Package secured. Target is safe. Suspects in custody. Medical confirms 0 injuries to the child. The breath left my lungs in a massive, ragged gasp. Hot tears of pure, overwhelming relief flooded down my cheeks, dropping heavily onto my wrinkled blouse. She was safe. My little girl was completely safe. The invisible hands that had been crushing my throat and restricting my breathing for the past 48 hours instantly vanished. I leaned my head back against the driver's seat and closed my eyes, letting myself cry for exactly 60 seconds. I pictured Lily wrapped in a warm blanket, surrounded by federal agents who had just saved her life. I pictured the hired thugs lying face down in the dirt in handcuffs. The extortion plot had officially failed. The hostage was free. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I reached up and aggressively wiped the wet tears from my face. I smoothed down my messy hair. The terrified victim was officially dead. The mourning, vulnerable widow was entirely gone. The compliant, reliable scapegoat my parents had aggressively exploited for my entire life had been completely erased from existence. I was no longer a desperate mother begging for her child. I was a senior financial auditor, holding a folder full of federal indictments, wire fraud evidence, and a verified path to prison for every single person waiting for me upstairs. I picked up my manila folder and opened the heavy car door, stepping out into the concrete garage. The echoing sound of my heels striking the pavement sounded like a ticking clock. I walked toward the glowing elevator banks with absolute purpose. I pressed the button for the top floor. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, carrying me up into the lion den. They wanted me to sign away my future. They wanted to steal my dead husband trust fund to cover up their own massive charitable embezzlement. They wanted to force me to smile and thank them for returning a child they had violently stolen from a school playground. I stepped off the elevator and into the lavish marble reception area of the corporate law firm. The receptionist smiled politely and asked for my name. I gave it to her, keeping my voice low and completely subservient, playing my part perfectly. She pointed me down a long glass-walled corridor toward the main executive boardroom. I clutched the manila folder tightly against my chest. The victim act was over. It was time to walk through those doors and absolutely destroy their entire world. The heavy glass door of the executive boardroom felt like a solid block of ice against my palm. I took one final deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. I could feel the small, flat square of the federal recording device taped securely against my ribs beneath my blouse. The thin wire snaked up my side, a hidden tether connecting me to the tactical command center, currently listening to my every heartbeat. I adjusted my grip on the manila folder I had brought with me, letting my shoulders slump just enough to project utter defeat. I pushed the door open and stepped into the lion den. The sheer arrogance radiating from the people sitting inside that room hit me like a physical wave. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the downtown Chicago skyline. The center of the room was dominated by a massive polished mahogany table that looked like it cost more than my entire first year of college. Sitting around that magnificent table, looking completely relaxed and perfectly entitled, were the 4 people who had orchestrated the absolute destruction of my life. Trent sat at the head of the table, leaning back in an expensive, ergonomic leather chair. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and a heavy gold watch gleamed on his wrist. He did not look like a man who had just committed federal wire fraud and interstate kidnapping. He looked like a triumphant king, waiting for a peasant to bring him his requested tribute. To his right sat my younger sister, Jessica, The golden child was dressed in a pristine white silk blouse and designer trousers, looking like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot rather than a ransom exchange. She was actively scrolling through her phone, tapping the screen with an immaculate French manicure, completely unbothered by the fact that she was currently using a stolen 6-year-old child to cover up her massive charitable embezzlement. She did not even bother to look up when I walked into the room. My parents sat on the opposite side of the table. My father, Robert, kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood in front of him, entirely unwilling to meet my gaze. He was the silent enforcer, the man who always let my mother do the dirty work while he reaped the financial benefits. But it was my mother, Patricia, who truly commanded the space. She sat with perfect posture, a string of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone, gracefully sipping sparkling water from a crystal tumbler. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, she set her glass down and let out a long, slow sigh of profound annoyance. "You look absolutely dreadful, Sarah," my mother said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. She spoke to me with the exact same tone of disgust she used when finding mud on her pristine white carpets. "Please sit down so we can get this unpleasant business over with. Jessica has a very important spa appointment at noon, and we are already running behind schedule." I walked slowly toward the empty leather chair at the far end of the table, dragging my feet slightly to sell the illusion of a broken spirit. I did not say a word. I pulled the chair out and sank into it, keeping my eyes lowered, acting like a woman who had spent the last 3 days crying until she was completely hollow. Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany. He steepled his fingers together and offered me a smile that was so incredibly patronizing, it made my blood boil. "I am very glad you decided to stop fighting us, Sarah Trent," said, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial sympathy. "This does not have to be an ugly war. We are all family here. We all want what is best for the family structure. You simply had a brief lapse in judgment regarding your financial responsibilities to your sister, and we had to take necessary precautions to correct it. But today is about healing. Today is about making things right." He gestured to a thick stack of legal documents resting in the center of the table. Next to the documents sat a heavy black Mont Blanc pen. My mother picked up the stack of papers and slid them forcefully across the smooth wood. The documents came to a stop right in front of my hands. "These are the final irrevocable transfer authorizations for Mark Corporate Trust Fund." My mother explained, her tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "The total liquid value is exactly $2 million. You will sign the signature line on page 4 and the notarization line on page 7. Trent has already set up the receiving wire instructions for Jessica Charitable Foundation. Once the bank confirms the routing, you can go back to your quiet little life." I stared down at the documents. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They were sitting in a towering glass skyscraper, sipping imported water, and asking me to sign away the only financial protection my dead husband had left for his orphaned daughter. They felt no shame. They felt no guilt. They believed they were entirely entitled to every single dollar I possessed because I was the scapegoat, and my only purpose in this family was to serve as their permanent funding source. I slowly reached out and touched the edge of the paper. I let my hand tremble visibly, making sure they saw my physical weakness. "Where is Lily?" I asked, my voice cracking intentionally. "I need to know my daughter is safe before I sign anything." Jessica finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Sarah," she complained. "Stop acting like we threw her in a dungeon. She is perfectly fine. She is having a little vacation while you sort out your selfish behavior." I forced a fresh wave of tears to well up in my eyes, looking directly at Trent. "I am not signing this until you tell me exactly what the arrangement is," I pleaded, letting my voice waver with manufactured desperation. "You sent me her tracking watch. You took her out of state. I need to hear you say that she is safe and that she is coming back to me." I knew the federal agents were listening to every single word through the wire taped to my ribs. I needed Trent to verbally confirm the specific details of the extortion. I needed him to explicitly state the terms of the ransom on a federal recording. Trent let out a soft, condescending chuckle. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, and he simply could not resist the opportunity to boast about his brilliant legal maneuvering. "Your daughter is entirely safe, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug, satisfied grin. "I secured an emergency custody order from a very friendly judge in a rural jurisdiction out west. She is currently staying at a private, secluded property in the mountains of Montana. I have 2 very reliable associates watching over her right now. They are making sure she stays comfortably inside the cabin until this financial transaction is fully completed." "And if I sign this document?" I asked, pointing a trembling finger at the wire transfer authorization. "What exactly happens next? I need to hear the actual terms, Trent." "Please, I am begging you." Trent smiled broadly, utterly convinced he had me trapped in an inescapable legal corner. "It is a very simple transaction, Sarah. You sign over the $2 million to the Jessica Vance Charitable Foundation today. The moment my bank confirms the wire transfer has cleared, I will contact the judge in Montana. I will personally file a motion to dismiss the emergency custody order, claiming that the family has resolved the mental health concerns regarding your parenting." And then what I pressed, pushing him to cement the kidnapping charge. "And then Patricia will call the men at the cabin." Trent continued smoothly, completely oblivious to the fact that he was confessing to a massive federal crime. "They will drive Lily to the local airport and put her on a private charter flight back to Chicago. You will have your daughter back in your house by dinner time tonight. You buy your peace of mind, and Jessica gets the funding her charity requires to pass her upcoming financial review." Everyone walks away happy. I looked over at my mother. She was watching me with cold, calculating eyes. "Is that true, Mom?" I asked, letting a sob slip from my throat. "You are literally holding my 6-year-old daughter hostage in a cabin in Montana just to force me to pay for Jessica lifestyle. You are trading your own granddaughter for money." My mother slammed her hand down on the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. "Do not use that dramatic tone with me. Sarah," she snapped, her voice sharp and vicious. "Nobody is holding anyone hostage. We are simply enforcing a necessary family contribution. You have been hoarding Mark money for years, while your sister has been struggling to maintain her foundation. You owe this to us. After everything we have done for you, taking you back in after Mark died, trying to manage your messy life, this is the absolute least you can do. Now stop whining and sign the paper." I looked down at the thick document. The signature line seemed to mock me. The federal agents in the command center now had Trent on tape, openly admitting to using a forged out-of-state custody order to hold a child at a specific location in Montana. They had my mother explicitly confirming the extortion demand. The elements of wire fraud, interstate kidnapping, and federal conspiracy had just been neatly wrapped up and handed to the Department of Justice with a beautiful bow. I picked up the heavy black Montblanc pen. The metal felt cool and solid in my grip. I needed to stall for just a few more minutes. I needed to ensure the tactical team in the Bitterroot Mountains had absolute confirmation that the target was secured before I dropped my own bomb on this pristine mahogany table. "Why through a charity?" I asked, keeping my eyes glued to the paper, pretending to read the fine print. "If you just want the money, why force me to wire it to Jessica Foundation? Why not just a direct transfer to your personal accounts?" Jessica scoffed, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. "Because a direct transfer would trigger massive gift taxes, you idiot," she sneered. "If you route it through the foundation, it counts as a charitable donation. It solves our accounting deficit completely tax-free. Honestly, Sarah, for a financial auditor, you are incredibly slow to understand basic wealth management." I kept my head down, hiding the sharp, predatory smile that threatened to break across my face. Jessica had just confessed to tax evasion and money laundering on a federal wire. They were literally handing me the nails for their own coffins. "It is a completely bulletproof strategy." Trent added, his voice thick with unearned pride. "The funds move directly into the foundation operating account, plugging a temporary cash flow issue we are currently experiencing. The federal auditors will review the foundation ledgers on Friday afternoon. They will see a perfectly balanced account, and they will close their inquiry. We secure our legacy, and you secure your daughter. Now, please, Sarah. My patience is wearing incredibly thin. Sign the authorization." I held the pen over the signature line. My heart was pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribcage right next to the hidden microphone. The silence in the room was absolute. My father was holding his breath. My mother was leaning forward, her eyes locked hungrily on the tip of my pen, waiting for the ink to touch the paper and transfer $2 million of my dead husband legacy into her greedy hands. My cell phone suddenly vibrated inside the front pocket of my blazer. It was a single sharp buzz. I stopped moving. The pen hovered exactly 1 inch above the document. "What is the problem now?" Patricia demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "Sign the damn paper, Sarah. We do not have all day." I slowly placed the heavy black pen down on the table. It landed with a soft, distinct click that echoed in the quiet boardroom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I unlocked the screen. A single encrypted text message from Special Agent David Reynolds was glowing brightly on the display. "Package secured. Target is safe." The air in my lungs released in a slow, silent exhale. The agonizing, suffocating weight of the past 48 hours vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated adrenaline. My little girl was safe. The tactical team had breached the isolated cabin and secured Lily. The armed accomplices were in federal custody. The hostage leverage holding this entire extortion plot together had just been completely neutralized. I looked up from my phone. I locked eyes with Trent, first, then Jessica, then my silent complicit father, and finally my mother. I reached up and deliberately smoothed my hair, dropping the hunched, defeated posture I had maintained since walking through the door. I sat up perfectly straight. The trembling in my hands disappeared completely. The manufactured tears dried on my cheeks. I placed my phone face down on the polished mahogany wood. "I am not going to sign this document, Trent," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, razor-sharp register that cut through the room like shattered glass. Trent's confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, threatening scowl. "Sarah," he warned, his tone dropping into a dangerous growl, "do not play games with me. I told you exactly what happens if you refuse to cooperate. I will make sure you do not see Lily until she is 18 years old. I will tie you up in court until you are completely bankrupt." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You will not be filing any motions, Trent. Because you are not going to be practicing law ever again." I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder I had carried into the room. The folder I had clutched to my chest like a shield. I flipped it open and pulled out a stack of documents that had absolutely nothing to do with a $2 million wire transfer. I laid the papers out across the beautiful, expensive table, sliding them forward so every single person in the room could read the bold federal letterhead printed at the top of the pages. The Victim Act was officially over. The corporate auditor had arrived, and it was time to collect the final debt. The heavy black pen sat on the polished mahogany table, exactly where I had placed it. Trent reached out and pushed it back across the smooth wood toward my hands, tapping the golden clip with his index finger. He let out a harsh breath of forced patience, telling me to stop delaying the inevitable and sign the transfer authorization. My mother, Patricia, crossed her arms over her chest, completely disgusted by what she perceived as my final pathetic attempt to stall. They all looked at me with such overwhelming contempt, absolutely certain that I was nothing more than a defeated woman cornered into surrendering my entire life. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I reached into the thick manila folder resting in my lap. I pulled out a stack of heavily stamped legal papers and dropped them directly onto the center of the table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I am not wiring a single dollar to your fake charity, Trent," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was completely level and absolutely freezing. "And you are never going to file another motion in any courtroom ever again." Trent scoffed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. He attempted to maintain his smug composure, but a tiny flicker of uncertainty crossed his dark eyes. He asked me what kind of ridiculous game I thought I was playing, reminding me that he held all the cards and that Lily was currently sitting hundreds of miles away in a secure location. He told me to stop being a dramatic nuisance and sign the paper before he made a phone call that would ruin my life permanently. I did not flinch. I slowly slid the first document across the table toward him. It was the geographic mapping report, combined with the digital footprint of his extortion email. "Your private location in Montana is not secure at all," I told him, watching his eyes dart down to the paper. "You were arrogant enough to attach the forged custody order directly from your personal tablet while logged into an unprotected local router. You sent me the exact coordinates of the foreclosed hunting cabin owned by your shell company, Apex Horizon Holdings." Trent sat entirely frozen. The confident smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His jaw dropped slightly as his eyes scanned the printed satellite image of the cabin and the verified corporate tax records proving his ownership. I slid the next document across the table, placing it right on top of his precious wire transfer instructions. It was a complete forensic breakdown of his fraudulent ex parte emergency custody order. I explained exactly how I had verified that the rural family court judge had never actually signed the petition. Trent had bypassed the standard legal protocol entirely by forging the signature of a magistrate whose campaign his law firm heavily funded. He had manufactured a fake emergency order to traffic a child across state lines, simply assuming nobody would ever have the financial expertise to trace his steps. "You committed federal wire fraud and interstate extortion using a forged judicial signature," I said, my voice ringing with total authority. "You did not use the legal system, Trent. You broke it, and you documented every single piece of your own felony on a corporate server." My father, Robert, stood up from his chair, his face turning the color of old ash. He looked at Trent, stammering and asking what I was talking about. Robert demanded to know if the court order was fake. My father had honestly believed Trent was a legal genius who had protected them with an airtight legal strategy. The realization that his son-in-law had actually dragged them into a massive federal kidnapping conspiracy was slowly dawning on his face. Trent could not even look at my father. He was staring at the forged documents on the table, breathing in heavy, shallow gasps, like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. The polished corporate shark had been completely gutted by a woman he thought was nothing more than an uneducated subordinate. I turned my attention away from Trent and looked directly at my sister. Jessica was sitting rigidly in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. She tried to roll her eyes, acting like this was just another one of my dramatic outbursts, but her breathing was entirely too fast. "You are next, Jessica," I said, sliding the thick stack of Internal Revenue Service tax filings toward her. I broke down the entire financial reality of her glamorous life. I explained aloud for everyone in the room to hear how she and Trent had used her philanthropic foundation as a personal piggy bank. I detailed the exact amounts they had embezzled from their wealthy country club friends, listing the fake community grants they had routed right back into their own pockets to pay for luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive vacations. Jessica's face turned absolutely chalk white. She tried to deny it, screaming that I was a jealous liar who simply wanted to ruin her perfect marriage. She insisted her charity was entirely legitimate and helped hundreds of underprivileged children. I did not raise my voice. I simply slid the final federal document across the table right into her hands. It was the unsealed federal docket from the Department of Justice. "The federal government knows exactly what you are doing, Jessica," I said, watching the sheer terror finally shatter her arrogant facade. "You are currently under an active federal investigation for massive tax evasion and money laundering. They audited your foundation 3 weeks ago. You are exactly $2 million short, and the federal prosecutors gave you until tomorrow at noon to produce the missing funds." My mother, Patricia, gasped, pressing her hand over her pearl necklace. She looked at Jessica with wide, terrified eyes. Patricia had served as a voluntary board member for the foundation, eager to secure her own high society status. She suddenly realized that when the federal government brought down the hammer, she would be indicted as a criminal Kyo conspirator. "That is why you abducted my daughter," I continued, my voice rising with absolute righteous fury. "You did not take Lily because you cared about her safety. You did not take her to punish me. You took my innocent 6-year-old child because you are cornered desperate criminals who needed to steal my dead husband trust fund to pay back the federal government before you all end up in a penitentiary. You tried to use my little girl as a human shield to save yourselves from federal prison. The silence in the grand corporate boardroom was absolutely deafening. The illusion of their wealthy, perfect, successful family had been entirely violently destroyed. They were not elite socialites or powerful attorneys. They were desperate thieves staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Patricia stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me, desperately clinging to the only piece of leverage she believed they still possessed. "It does not matter what you found, Sarah." My mother shouted, her voice cracking with raw panic. "It does not matter what those papers say. We still have your daughter." The men at that cabin do not know about any of this. If you walk out of this room without signing that wire transfer, they will take Lily and you will never see her again. You have to sign it. We will go to prison if you do not sign it. The sheer disgusting selfishness of her demand was breathtaking. My own mother was openly admitting to kidnapping her granddaughter and actively threatening a child life just to save herself from the consequences of her own criminal greed. She truly believed that my maternal terror would ultimately force me to surrender. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted message I had received from Special Agent David Reynolds just moments before walking into the room. I turned the bright screen around and held it up for every single person at the table to see. The high-resolution photograph showed my beautiful daughter Lily wrapped securely in a thick Federal Bureau of Investigation thermal blanket. She was sitting in the back of a warm tactical vehicle, sipping a juice box and smiling brightly at the camera. Standing directly behind her were 3 heavily armed federal hostage rescue agents. "You do not have my daughter anymore, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "The federal tactical team breached your little hunting cabin 10 minutes ago. Lily is completely safe. Your hired accomplices are currently lying face down in the snow wearing federal handcuffs, and the men who secured my daughter are currently listening to every single word you have said in this room." I reached down and tapped the small recording device hidden beneath my blouse. The color entirely drained from my mother's face. Her knees completely buckled, and she collapsed back into her leather chair, letting out a low, guttural sound of pure, absolute defeat. My father put his head in his hands and began to quietly sob, realizing that his entire life was over. He had thrown away his only loyal daughter to protect a golden child who had ultimately dragged him into a federal kidnapping charge. And then the true nature of my family finally revealed itself in all its ugly, disgusting glory. Jessica realized that the extortion had failed. She realized the $2 million was ever going to arrive, and the federal auditors were going to demand the missing money tomorrow at noon. The beautiful, polished golden child completely snapped. She threw a massive, violent tantrum right there in the corporate boardroom. She slammed her hands onto the table and turned furiously on her husband. She screamed at Trent, calling him a stupid, arrogant failure. She blamed him for the entire embezzlement, claiming she never knew where the charity money was actually going. She swore she was just the face of the foundation and that Trent had forced her to sign all the fraudulent tax returns. Trent shot to his feet, his face purple with rage, screaming right back at her. He called her a greedy, ungrateful parasite, reminding her that she was the one demanding luxury cars and private flights. He told her she was equally responsible for every single stolen dollar and that he would happily hand over all of her private text messages to the federal prosecutors to secure himself a plea deal. Jessica then turned her vicious panic toward our parents. She pointed at my mother and screamed that the kidnapping was entirely Patricia's idea. She sobbed hysterically, claiming she never wanted to involve Lily and that her mother had manipulated the whole emergency custody plan because she hated me. Patricia cried out in absolute shock, begging Jessica to stop talking, but the golden child was completely unhinged. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves. When the ship finally starts to sink, The rats will always turn on each other to survive. I stood quietly at the end of the table, watching them tear each other to absolute pieces. For 29 years, I had believed that I was the broken one. I had spent my entire life feeling inadequate, shrinking myself to fit into the tiny, pathetic space they had assigned me. I had emptied my savings to pay their fake medical debts and endured their constant psychological abuse because I thought family meant unconditional loyalty. But looking at them now, screaming and crying and throwing each other to the federal wolves, I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of freedom. They were completely pathetic. The powerful, intimidating parents who had thrown my belongings on the porch and drained my husband's life insurance were gone. They were just greedy, miserable people who had finally run out of lies. Trent grabbed his expensive briefcase and lunged toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, desperate to escape the building before the authorities arrived. He thought he could outrun a federal indictment. He thought he could slip away into the busy downtown Chicago streets and vanish, but he did not even make it halfway across the room. I stood perfectly still, calmly buttoning my suit jacket, as the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom suddenly swung wide open. The screaming and shouting at the mahogany table instantly died, plunging the room into a heavy, terrified silence. The time for talking was over. The trap had permanently closed, and the final, absolute reckoning had arrived. I looked at my mother one last time. She was staring at the doorway, her hands trembling violently against her pearl necklace. Her eyes begged me for a mercy she had never once shown me. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted the quiet, reliable daughter to step in and clean up the massive, catastrophic mess they had made of their lives. But I just shook my head slowly. "You built this cage entirely by yourself, Mom," I told her softly. "Now you get to live in it." Jessica dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, weeping wildly and clutching her designer purse against her chest as the reality of her shattered life crushed the breath from her lungs. She would never walk the pristine greens of her country club again. She would never sip champagne at a charity gala funded by stolen money. The golden child had finally fallen from her pedestal, and the crash was absolutely spectacular to witness. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. For the first time in my entire existence, the overwhelming weight of my family expectations was gone completely, leaving behind a woman who had finally learned her own true worth. I had won. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom did not just open, they were violently thrust apart. A flood of dark tactical windbreakers and gleaming gold federal badges poured into the pristine corporate space. The sheer physical presence of the federal agents instantly shattered the quiet, arrogant atmosphere my family had so carefully cultivated. There was absolutely no time for them to react or attempt to run. The room was immediately secured from every possible angle. Special Agent David Reynolds walked in first, his face a mask of absolute stone. He held a thick stack of federal arrest warrants in his hands. He did not look like a man who was willing to negotiate. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Trent froze completely, his expensive leather briefcase slipping from his fingers and hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. For a fraction of a second, his brain simply could not process the reality of the situation. He was a senior corporate attorney, accustomed to commanding respect and instilling fear. He tried to puff out his chest and project the aura of an untouchable legal mastermind. He demanded to know the exact meaning of this outrageous intrusion, claiming loudly that federal agents had absolutely no jurisdiction in his private firm without passing through the proper legal channels. David Reynolds did not even blink. He stepped right up to Trent and read the federal charges aloud, his deep voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. He listed interstate kidnapping, wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. He recited the penal codes with a cold, mechanical precision that left absolutely no room for debate. Trent tried to argue, using complex legal jargon in a desperate attempt to talk his way out of the trap, but a massive tactical agent simply grabbed his arms and forcefully twisted them behind his back. Trent let out a sharp gasp of pain and shock. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful, incredible sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The brilliant corporate shark had been completely neutralized in a matter of seconds. My sister Jessica witnessed the steel cuffs close around her husband's wrists, and she completely lost her mind. The pristine golden child began backing away into the far corner of the boardroom, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She looked like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum in a grocery store, rather than a grown woman facing federal indictments. When a female federal agent approached her, Jessica actually tried to swat her hands away, crying hysterically about her expensive silk blouse and her incredibly important afternoon spa appointment. She demanded they let her go instantly, insisting she was just a helpless victim. She screamed that Trent had forced her to sign the fraudulent tax returns and that she had absolutely no idea where the charity money had gone. She then pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at our mother, claiming the kidnapping plot was entirely Patricia's idea and that she had never wanted to involve my daughter at all. It was an absolutely pathetic display of cowardice. The agent was entirely unimpressed by the theatrical weeping. She swiftly spun Jessica around and secured her wrists tightly behind her back, completely ignoring the endless stream of frantic, pathetic sobbing. My father, Robert, did not fight at all. He simply sank to his knees on the beautiful, expensive boardroom rug. He looked exactly like a balloon that had been entirely deflated. All the years of passively enabling my mother's toxic behavior, all the times he deliberately looked the other way while I was emotionally abused, had finally caught up to him. He was a weak, miserable coward, and he knew his comfortable suburban life was officially over. A tall agent hauled him to his feet without a shred of gentleness and cuffed him while he stared blankly at the floor, entirely unresponsive to the chaos exploding around him. Then there was my mother. Patricia was hyperventilating her hands, hovering over her authentic pearl necklace as her chest heaved with raw, unadulterated panic. As an agent stepped toward her, she lunged in my direction, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She pleaded with me to make them stop right now. She begged me to tell the agents it was all just a big, terrible misunderstanding between family members. She reminded me that she was my mother, the woman who had given me life, and that I could not possibly let them take her away like a common criminal. I looked at her completely unmoved by her fake maternal tears. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I stood perfectly straight and told her that a real mother does not steal her own innocent granddaughter just to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal felony. I told her that she was absolutely nothing to me anymore. The federal agent firmly grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back, slapping the cold steel cuffs onto her wrists with a sharp finality. Patricia began to wail, producing a high-pitched, keening sound of pure social devastation. David Reynolds gave a short, authoritative nod, and the agents began marching my family toward the boardroom exit. I followed closely behind them, wanting to witness every single agonizing second of their spectacular public downfall. I had spent 29 years living in their shadow, and I was going to watch them burn in the light. We stepped out of this boardroom and into the main corridor of the prestigious law firm. The entire floor had come to an absolute standstill. The normal sounds of ringing phones and clacking keyboards were entirely gone, replaced by a stunned, suffocating silence. Dozens of junior associates, paralegals, and legal secretaries were standing outside their cubicles, staring in pure shock. The walk down that long hallway was a masterclass in total humiliation. Trent tried to bow his head down to his chest to hide his face from his colleagues, but the agents kept a firm grip on his arms, keeping him moving forward on display for the entire office. He was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored charcoal suit wrinkling as he struggled against the restraints. The men and women he had bullied and intimidated for years were now watching him being paraded through the office like a common street thug. Jessica was still weeping loudly, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, ruining her flawless makeup. She kept trying to pull away from the female agent, stumbling clumsily in her expensive designer heels. She was completely mortified that these ordinary office workers were witnessing the absolute destruction of her high society image. She whined and complained about the handcuffs hurting her delicate wrists, but nobody offered her a shred of sympathy. My parents shuffled behind them, looking like two incredibly old and fragile strangers. The illusion of their wealthy, perfect, successful family had been violently stripped away, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated shame. As we reached the center of the massive glass-walled lobby, the double doors of the senior executive suite swung open. The managing partners of the firm, the incredibly wealthy elite lawyers Trent had spent years trying to impress and emulate, stepped out into the hallway to see what was causing the massive disruption. The founding partner, an older, distinguished man with silver hair, stared at Trent in absolute disgust. Trent opened his mouth desperately, trying to explain the situation, claiming that this was a massive misunderstanding and that he would have the whole thing cleared up by the afternoon. He begged his partners not to judge him before he could present his defense. But the older man simply shook his head slowly, turned his back, and walked back into his executive suite, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut behind him. In that singular, quiet moment, Trent's entire lucrative legal career vaporized into absolute nothingness. The message was incredibly clear. The firm was cutting all ties immediately. He would be disbarred before the end of the week. He would never step foot in a courtroom again unless he was wearing an orange prison uniform. The realization hit him so hard, his knees actually buckled, and the federal agents had to physically drag him toward the exit. We reached the main elevator banks at the end of the lobby. The agents pressed the call button, securing their 4 prisoners against the cold marble walls to wait for the descending cars. I stood a few feet away, watching my parents leaning against the smooth stone. They were both in their late 60s. They were not young people who could easily bounce back from a minor setback. The sheer magnitude of the federal charges against them, wire fraud, extortion, and the interstate kidnapping of a minor meant they were facing massive mandatory minimum sentences. They were staring down decades behind bars. I could see the exact moment the horrific reality finally settled over their minds. They were suddenly realizing that there would be no more expensive country club dinners. There would be no more lavish tropical holidays or brand new luxury cars. They were going to lose their beautiful suburban home to federal asset forfeiture to pay back the stolen charity funds. They were going to trade their comfortable manicured lives for a tiny concrete cell, a thin mattress, and a stainless steel toilet. They were going to grow incredibly old and eventually die in a federal penitentiary, and they had absolutely nobody to blame but their own disgusting, limitless greed. My mother looked up at me one last time, her eyes completely empty and hollow. She did not look arrogant or entitled anymore. She just looked broken. The quiet, reliable daughter they had relentlessly abused and exploited for decades had finally orchestrated their absolute ruin with flawless, terrifying precision. The elevator doors chimed brightly and slid open, revealing the empty steel car. The federal agents firmly pushed my family inside, crowding into the small space alongside them. David Reynolds turned to me before stepping into the elevator. He offered a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the incredible strength it took to pull off the dangerous deception. "The tactical team has a transport vehicle waiting for you downstairs," he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "They are bringing Lily back to the city right now. You can meet her at the secure field office." "Thank you," I whispered, feeling a fresh wave of genuine grateful tears prick my eyes. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." David smiled and stepped into the elevator, turning around to face the lobby. I stood alone in the quiet marble hallway, watching the heavy metal doors slowly close over the terrified, weeping faces of the people who had tried to destroy me. The doors clicked shut with a heavy finality, severing them from my life completely and permanently. The dark, suffocating nightmare was finally over. The heavy, invisible chains of guilt and familial obligation that had weighed me down since childhood were entirely gone, leaving my soul feeling incredibly light and completely free. I turned away from the elevator banks and walked toward the emergency stairwell, feeling a massive, warm smile spread across my face. I did not care about the millions of dollars in the corporate trust fund anymore. I did not care about the money my parents had stolen from me in the past. All of that was just meaningless paper. I had survived the ultimate betrayal, and I had protected the only thing in the world that truly mattered to me. I was a free woman, and I was going to see my beautiful daughter. The drive to the federal field office felt like floating through a bizarre dream. The heavy, gray clouds that had choked the Chicago skyline all morning were finally beginning to break apart, letting bright shafts of winter sunlight spill across the wet pavement. I parked my car in the visitor lot and walked through the heavy glass doors of the building. My legs felt incredibly heavy, but my heart was beating with a frantic, joyful rhythm. Special Agent David Reynolds was waiting for me in the main lobby. He offered a warm, genuine smile that completely transformed his usually stern face. He did not say a word. He simply placed his hand gently on my shoulder and led me down a long, pristine white corridor toward the secure family processing center. Every single step I took echoed loudly against the linoleum floor. For 29 years, I had lived in a constant state of defensive anxiety, always waiting for the next cruel insult or financial demand from my parents. I had spent my entire life bracing for impact, but walking down that hallway, I finally realized that the invisible weight crushing my chest had completely vanished. David stopped in front of a solid oak door and turned the handle. I stepped into the room and my entire world instantly righted itself. Lily was sitting at a small circular table in the center of the room. She was wearing an oversized Federal Bureau of Investigation fleece jacket that draped completely over her small shoulders, keeping her warm. A kind female agent was sitting across from her, sliding a small pile of colorful building blocks across the table. Lily was happily eating a red apple, completely unharmed and blissfully unaware of the massive criminal conspiracy that had surrounded her for the past 48 hours. She looked up when the door opened. Her big bright eyes widened and she dropped the piece of fruit onto the table. "Mommy!" she cried out, her voice ringing with pure, innocent joy. I fell to my knees on the carpet, right as she ran across the room and threw her small arms tightly around my neck. The physical impact of her little body crashing into mine knocked the remaining breath completely out of my lungs. I buried my face in her soft hair, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent of her shampoo, mixed with the crisp mountain air that still clung to her clothes. I held her so tightly that my arms ached silently, promising her and myself that I would never let anyone hurt us ever again. Hot, heavy tears of absolute relief soaked into the collar of her shirt. I wept until there was absolutely nothing left inside me but pure, profound gratitude. The nightmare was officially over. My beautiful daughter was safe. The federal justice system is notorious for moving slowly, but when it finally drops the hammer, it crushes corporate criminals with absolute devastation. The following months were a whirlwind of grand jury testimonies, forensic accounting reviews, and highly public federal indictments. My family had spent their entire lives obsessing over their pristine public image, relying on their wealth and status to shield them from consequences. But there is absolutely nowhere to hide when the Department of Justice decides to tear your life apart. Trent and Jessica were hit with a mountain of federal charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and the interstate kidnapping of a minor. The trial was an absolute media spectacle. The local news stations gleefully reported every single sordid detail of their massive charity embezzlement scheme. The arrogant, successful corporate attorney and the beautiful golden child philanthropist were publicly exposed as nothing more than greedy, desperate thieves who had stolen millions of dollars from their own wealthy friends. When they realized the overwhelming volume of evidence I had handed to the federal prosecutors, their completely manufactured loyalty instantly evaporated. They turned on each other like starving animals. Trent desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal by claiming Jessica was the true mastermind behind the fraudulent charity. He offered to surrender all of her private communications and spending ledgers to save his own skin. Jessica retaliated by weeping hysterically on the witness stand, blaming her husband and my parents for manipulating her into signing the tax returns. She actually tried to use her country club tears on a seasoned federal judge, but the judge was entirely repulsed by her sheer unapologetic greed and her willingness to use a 6-year-old child as a human shield. There was no leniency, and there were no quiet backroom deals. Trent was permanently disbarred, completely disgraced in the legal community, and sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Jessica, the woman who had mocked my small apartment and demanded constant financial sacrifices from me, was handed the exact same 10-year sentence. She screamed out loud as the federal marshals placed her in handcuffs right there in the courtroom. Her designer silk blouses and expensive manicures were permanently replaced by a standard-issue prison uniform. She will spend the rest of her 30s and almost all of her 40s locked behind a wall of steel and concrete, entirely forgotten by the high society friends she had robbed. But the most profound and poetic justice was reserved for my parents. Robert and Patricia desperately tried to play the role of innocent, bewildered grandparents. They claimed they had absolutely no idea that Trent and Jessica were embezzling money. They swore they only took Lily to Montana because they genuinely believed my mental health was failing. They thought they could simply walk away from the wreckage and return to their comfortable suburban estate. They completely forgot that federal auditors are incredibly thorough. When the Internal Revenue Service tore through my parents' financial history, searching for the missing charity funds, they uncovered a totally different crime. They found the exact meticulously documented paper trail of the $300,000 life insurance payout my parents had stolen from me 3 years earlier when Mark passed away. They had quietly funneled my dead husband money through a series of offshore accounts to pay for their luxury vehicles and their country club memberships. The federal government does not forgive financial theft. The agents initiated an aggressive asset forfeiture protocol. My parents' massive, beautiful suburban home, the house where I had spent my entire childhood feeling like a worthless burden, was immediately seized and liquidated by the state. Their imported cars were repossessed. Every single bank account they possessed was completely frozen and drained to provide full financial restitution to me and to pay their massive federal fines. They lost absolutely everything. The wealth and status they had valued above their own daughter were wiped out in a matter of weeks. They avoided prison time by cooperating with the prosecutors against Trent, but they were left utterly destitute. I heard through a distant relative that they are currently living in a cramped, miserable one-bedroom apartment, relying entirely on Social Security checks and bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen about their ungrateful daughter. I do not care. I've not spoken a single word to them since I walked out of that glass-walled boardroom, and I never will again. 3 years have passed since that dark, stormy morning. My life today looks absolutely nothing like the miserable, frightened existence I used to endure. The $300,000 in life insurance money was fully restored to my accounts, allowing me to buy a beautiful, quiet home in a wonderful neighborhood with excellent schools. Mark's Secure Trust Fund remains completely untouched, safely growing and gathering interest for Lily Future, just as he always intended. I was promoted to a director position at my auditing firm, recognized for my relentless dedication to uncovering complex financial fraud. I wake up every single morning and drink my coffee on a sunny back porch, listening to the birds sing. I watch Lily run across the green grass, laughing and playing with the joyful innocence every child deserves. Our home is filled with warmth and music and absolute peace. Sometimes I look back at the woman I used to be, the woman who quietly paid her family bills and endured their constant cruel insults because she believed that blood obligated her to suffer. I used to believe that if I just sacrificed enough of my own happiness, they would eventually love me. I thought that keeping the peace meant destroying my own boundaries. But standing in that boardroom watching my family willing to trade my child life for their own financial salvation taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire existence. Family is supposed to be a safe haven, not a financial hostage situation. You do not owe loyalty to people who view you as a resource. You do not owe your time, your money, or your mental health to people who only call you when they need something to be fixed. You do not owe respect to parents who actively choose to prioritize a golden child while treating you like a disposable servant. Blood simply makes you related. It does not give anyone the right to abuse you, to steal from you, or to make you feel like you are impossible to love. Love is demonstrated through consistent respect, through protection, and through genuine care. If the people who raised you cannot provide those basic human requirements, you have every single right to pack your bags and walk away without a shred of guilt. Setting a boundary is not an act of revenge. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Walking away from toxic people is the bravest, most beautiful thing you can ever do for yourself. It is terrifying to step out into the unknown and leave behind the only family dynamic you have ever known. But I promise you that the peace you will find on the other side is worth every single moment of fear. You can build a new life. You can build a new family out of friends and people who actually cherish your presence. You can reclaim your narrative and absolutely refuse to be the victim anymore. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey. Sharing this story was not easy, but I know there are so many of you out there who are carrying the exact same heavy, invisible burdens. If my experience resonated with you, or if it gave you the courage to finally stand up for your own worth, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever had to draw a hard, permanent boundary with a toxic family member? Have you ever walked away from people who only saw you as a resource? Where did you find the strength to finally say, enough is enough? Please share your own stories of breaking free in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and we are building an amazing, supportive community here together. If you want to hear more stories about ordinary people, finding their voice and standing up to manipulation, check out the video linked on the screen right now. Remember that you hold the pen to your own life story. Do not ever let anyone else write your ending. Stay strong, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.